Okay, why don't we get started? So we're gonna go ahead and get started. So calling to order the Assembly Legislative Committee it's still this, I was going to say December again. It's still September 21st. 1:20 p.m. We are noticed till 2:20 p.m. So we'll go around the room and do introductions. Myself, Member Brawley, chairing this committee.
Felix Vera.
Karen Brownbet.
Scott Myers. Zach Johnson.
And on the phone we have Mr. Martinez.
Yeah, thank you.
And is there anyone else on the phone? Okay, and I know we had a couple members excused today. So let's go ahead and move to our agenda. So just generally the plan for today is to give some brief updates on what we've been working on in terms of our legislative program, which is our biggest responsibility as this committee. And then I want to save most of the time to actually look at the working draft that we have and kind of start talking through that in more detail. And I appreciate members who have brought forward recommendations to start looking at our priorities, but also to say this is not the only time to input those, so it's really just a work in progress. So with that, let's go to unfinished business. So just briefly, I'll turn to one of the printouts you have, the revised committee work plan and schedule. So this is mainly a report out our prior meeting on August 3rd. We looked at the committee description. We talked about some updates to that. So we have implemented that. That's the first piece at the top of the agenda, or at the top of that document. And then we've put forward some broad goals. And then these are things that were not quite presented in this way before, but we've been working very collaboratively with Ms. Costello from the administration. And actually, I'll pause there and say also, I forgot to acknowledge that in addition to members in the room, we have our member of Assembly Council, we have legislative services staff, we have Ms. Costello from the mayor's office, and then we have one individual in the back from the administration. So then back to the document. So we're looking really, the original schedule that I put forward in our last meeting has been revised, and kind of the big picture is we're really looking to move up the process of developing a legislative program, ideally passing it in November, or if needed on our December 5th meeting to meet our deadline in code. And then really working collaboratively and jointly with the mayor's office to identify municipal-wide priorities, as well as making sure that we have department priorities, member priorities, really kind of all the big things that we want to communicate to the state legislature as far as our legislative program. So in order to do that, and I won't read this out in detail, but just showing, starting with last month in August and moving to the end of 2023 and then early into 2024, we have a series of meetings scheduled and other kind of other efforts, including some other, like for example, our Complex Behavioral Health Task Force Summit, from which there were recommendations for that particular item. So really just trying to knit all those things together into a coherent piece, which is our legislative program, and then things that we want to continue to advocate for. So I'll just note that we have these committee meetings on the schedule. So instead of, I think we had more meetings in December, so it essentially just moves it up. So these are already on your schedule, and then I'll just also note we're working ahead to 2024 and making sure that we have our priorities ready for when the AML, the Alaska Municipal League Conference, happens down in February, because that's often a time that members travel down for the administration. So I'll just pause there and see if there's any questions on this schedule or any other issues. Go ahead, Ms. Bromhead.
So this list we got before this 2023 are items that should have been appropriated this year, or are these things that will actually happen in 2024? They're the legislative priorities for 23. I just, you know how the fiscal year thing throws me for loops. Do you have any idea?
Yeah, maybe I'll look to Ms. Ross to answer that in terms of kind of what the 2023 documents are.
Sorry, I'm struggling with getting my computer displayed up on the screens, and I did not have a question.
Oh, before, we got this from the Desk of Legislative Services, the legislative program for 2023. There was a list of items. So would these be ones that we're looking to have completed in 24? They're kind of on the list for 23, but the action happens in 24?
Yep, they're ones that we asked for last year. I don't know if we got we didn't get the report cut last year, so I guess that was our main accomplishment from the 2023 session. So I don't think we got any of those things on the list. So almost in that Word document, this top priorities list, almost all of them were carried over, except we still had questions about, so if you look at the additional municipal-wide priorities, most of them got bumped into there in this Word document. And then we still had questions about that Ms. Casello was gonna research and get back to us on if there's still a need for the Performing Arts Center, wildfire protection money. And then I think everything else got carried over.
Thanks.
Oh, I think Merrifield got.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll note too, we'll spend most of our time kind of looking through this draft and then talking about how it relates to what's still in place, which is the 23 priorities and figuring all that out. So I think if there's not any other questions or comments, this is really just an informational item on the work plan, but just communicating that this is the process that we're hoping to use to work toward, again, a collaborative and jointly developed legislative program that also all members have an opportunity to really provide input on it and weigh in on. So we'll continue to work through that, and that's what we want to do today. And then I'll also note for our legislative program process update, that was really part of this document, just kind of the timeline. So then I will move us on to new business, and actually I should have put these differently. I'm going to flip A and B so that we can keep the working draft discussion together. Just a brief update on connecting with the Anchorage Caucus. So one upcoming meeting, which is not a committee meeting, but it's a meeting with myself and Assembly Chair Constant, with members of the Anchorage delegation or Anchorage Caucus. I've heard both terms used, so apologies if I use them interchangeably. And that will be on Thursday, October 5th. And so that one is not a publicly noticed meeting by the request of those folks, but really a chance to provide some preliminary information about the work that the municipality is doing and the Assembly's priorities specifically, and have a discussion, a chance to have conversation. And so that's the initial meeting, and then the other thing that maybe I'll turn to Ms. Casello to give a brief update on is that we are also scheduling a meeting or an event for December 1st, which everybody can participate in. And so I'll turn to Ms. Casello briefly to share about that.
Thank you. So we've identified December 1st from 11:30 to 1 at the Denina Center for the Mayor's Legislative Update, and we'll be sending out a save the date to the Anchorage Caucus and to you all. So that's the plan for that is going on really well.
Yeah, thank you. So we just got that one finalized. We got the co-chairs of the Anchorage Caucus to say that date works for them. And so hopefully we'll have good participation on the legislature side. And then, that will be an opportunity again for everybody to participate and discuss. And then I'll say also, of course, the contact doesn't just have to be from Assembly leadership or from myself as the legislative committee chair. So if there are items that you would like to reach out to, we can help kind of facilitate that, or certainly reach out to your members in your districts as well, as I know people already do. But really we're working to kind of more formalize or strengthen the relationship between the municipality and the legislature, especially our Anchorage Caucus. So these are all in service of that. And I'll see if, Claire, do you want to add anything as well? Okay.
I'm just super excited. We are so far ahead of schedule compared to last year. It's really neat. It's really neat working with you, Ms. Costello.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Ms. Bronco?
So I was beating around the bush to ask. So in this case, there's something that nobody knows what it is. nobody. Chief Curl, I've been sent to everybody to ask them what Halogen Street fire protection is. So I'd like to look at that one as going away. I don't know anybody who knows what that is. Maybe the mayor knows, but I don't, nobody knows in District 5. So,
Yeah, I can speak briefly, and I see Claire wanted to mention too. So that was in well, what was passed last year, but is in this year's legislative program 2023. And I see Claire turning to the page. So I also do not have more information about that other than it was in there. But I guess maybe that's a good segue into our next item. So I'm going to formally move us to the, because it's really A and C on our new business, which is looking at the working draft of the legislative program. And then I'll kind of frame before we dive into the document. So the goal with this is, one, to really identify and prioritize, especially our citywide priorities. I'm going to keep using the port as an example. I think there's broad agreement about that. There's pretty broad agreement on the direction. And we know that that's a really top priority to continue asking for. Then we also want to look at other citywide priorities in terms of, facilities to fix up or legislation that impacts the municipality. I'll use the light bill, SB 77 as an example. And then we also want to make sure that there's space for more local priorities, district level priorities, and in past programs that has also been sorted by, I believe, House and Senate District 2, so that it's easy for legislators to look and see within their own districts, what priorities match up. So that's the goal. And then also to say, we're not starting from scratch, so we do have the 2023 program and past programs, so that is our starting point. But we shouldn't feel just constrained by that, especially if we have, for example, projects that we're not sure what they are. So we should also feel free to make changes to this. And then before I turn to the staff, I'll also just say what you're looking at is a working draft. It says draft on it many places. We do want to make sure that we're doing this work in collaboration across the committee and with other members who are not here today. So just to say, please look at this as a draft and not as a final in any way. So with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Ross to maybe talk about where we are right now.
Okay, I spoke a little out of turn. So when I turned this document that we took to the legislature last year into this Word document, which will then go back into a pretty document like this afterwards, I didn't move all of those district priorities over. I left that blank because I don't think any of us who are here today are sure how this list was created. That Halogen Street was an AWU project. These ones in blue are AWU projects. And if you notice in this year's CIB, AWW isn't putting forward any projects to the state this year. They're changing their strategy and they're going straight to the federal government for their projects. And so, and then the rest are almost all road. And for a lot of you, road and sewer projects aren't necessarily your district priorities. I mean, I think you do have some road projects. But anyhow, I think just scratch all these ones in district priorities, and then you add your own. And then Ms. Costello, if the administration has ones or departments have ones that are top priorities, to somehow feed that into the process, and that's how we'll create this.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Myers.
Thank you, Ms. Ross. I'm wondering if you can just carry over District 2 since all of ours got vetoed last year. And because after I was looking at Karen's document, they're the exact same priorities that we were going to put forward, so.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a good point too I'll make, because I know Member Zalatown who's not here today, communicated about, I believe is the safety corridors along Tudor Road. And so that's also been a priority that the Assembly has talked about. I don't know if it got vetoed, but it didn't get funded. And so things like that, if there was something that is still a priority, please feel free to bring it forward. So I appreciate the continuity from District 2.
That was so sad. Yeah. I was like, oh, you remember they got organized, they picked the project, they got it funded, and then.
I think personality's gotten away.
Okay, well, why don't we, so we'll bring it back to 24, and we will look optimistically forward, and also realistically. So why don't we, I'm gonna again turn to Claire, to walk through essentially what we're looking at and then how we, worked up to this point to develop this, and then we can get into content, because I also want to acknowledge, we have, Member Rivera has priorities to put forward that are in, I think, the citywide category that relate to some of these big ones, so I want to talk about those. And then we also have, in addition to what we already have, we have priorities from Mr. Solt from South Anchorage, and so we can also look at those. So go ahead, Ms. Ross.
Okay. As I've mentioned a couple of times, the one problem with this document that we faced last time is it's just really big and there wasn't a ton of prioritization in the formatting of it. And so I think this year we want to just make it really clear. Here are the top 3 to 4 projects, and then that's what the lobbyists will be working on, the mayor and assembly leadership. And then there's a second level of additional municipal-wide priorities, and these ones are also very important, but maybe not as much of the lobbyist time. And what she said is she likes having this big list, because when she runs into people in the hallway or has a conversation and they say, oh, I really want to get the Halogen Street AWU project going, then she's like, oh, I can talk about it, I know about it. And so we don't want to reduce the list too much, because it's fine to have a bigger list, but we just really want to clarify what are the priorities and what's second level and then what's district level. And so based on what I've heard from you and what we've discussed in this committee, the top 3 projects are the Port of Alaska modernization will continue to be up there, increasing the supply of housing and addressing homelessness, and then crisis now mental health. We still have to tease all those out, and luckily Mr. Rivera, I think it's in your packet, gave us some great things to insert into those sections, and hopefully we'll get updates soon on the port on their specific ask. And then the administration brought up a 4th potential one of energy security with the Cook Inlet gas supply dwindling. Do we want to bring that up? And that could either stay at a top level or just go under municipal-wide priorities. Then moving down to municipal-wide priorities, these are ones that probably the legislative services team will be working on a lot, that they might not quite get the attention of assembly leadership, the mayor, and the lobbyists, but we'll be working with the different members who we know are interested in the particular ones and helping you advocate for one. I think we brought it up a number of times, but the election reform one was one that staff, once the leadership let us know that you wanted to work on it, then we were able to do a lot of work behind the scenes, working directly with legislators and their staff. And so we'll probably continue to do that for a lot of these. And then I'll just go briefly over everything and then we can go back up to the top. And so as I mentioned, the area-wide priorities, we pulled most of those from the 2023 list. We added a few that came up after we created our list, like the blight properties. And then there's a handful that need a little bit more research to see what the specific ask is. And then moving down, the district priorities, Wendy, the lobbyist, will keep an eye on these. Let us know if there's any interest in any of them, but for the most part, they're going to be up to you as members and the departments who want them to work on them on your own. So if one of you wants to go down to Juneau or have meetings and wants to talk about these issues, let legislative services know, and we can create fact sheets for you and let you know what we know, coordinate with the lobbyists. But other than that, we're going to expect you to advocate to your local representation and any other people down in Juneau that you know that can help with these. And so we got most of them filled out. We're still waiting on a few more of you. We hadn't decided yet how many should go in each one, so at some point we might be asking you to narrow these down with your district partners and with the departments and administration who represent them. But I think for now we want to have these lists pretty big and open and then start narrowing it down at a later date. And then moving to the last section, which is department priorities. And this, I just went to the draft CIB that was released with a 120-day memo, and I put those in there. There are some really big asks. 189 million for project management engineering, so this is a lot of road construction, pedestrian and safety upgrades. So I tried to just summarize those, but I think that's where assembly members should really go through that CIB list and see if there's ones that are really important to your district, and then kind of decide if you want to advocate for them to go on a bond when you all are in the budget process, or if you think that it has a chance with the state ask, and then you want to make sure it's on this list. And back in the day when I worked on bonds and legislation, we often asked for both. So we'd play them against each other. We'd put it in for a bond and for the state, usually a third private, a third bond, and a third state. And then once the bond passed, then we would go to the state and say, we've done our local match, now we need your match. And so you might not, the administration might have a different way of doing it, but you might not want to put all of your eggs in one basket, and it might be okay to have it on a bond and in here if you kind of split up the amount. So that's the overview of this document, and I guess I'll hand it back to Ms. Crawley if you want to go back to the top and just work our way down.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Ross. And I'll just note too, as you're reading through this, it is very much a working draft, so you'll also see some internal notes about, for example, the request for five priorities per district and other things. So just to say that we're using this to kind of ground the work, and then this will continue to get cleaned up and looking closer to final. So this is really a way to keep it all together. And then I'll also just note, as we go back up to our main priorities, you'll see some of the notes are not just what the actual ask is, or maybe the ask hasn't been determined, but it's also really a start to drafting the narrative that will go with each of those priorities. So for example, I'll pick on the board again. We know that we have a lot of activity that we did. We're making progress, so we want to make sure we're communicating that back. And so some of those notes in there as well are those pieces. So if you see something that we should be highlighting that we've done, please also mention that too, and especially if you share it with legislative services staff, because they're tracking it. So with that, why don't we go back up to the top, and then we can kind of briefly walk through. And then Member Rivera, I know you had comments on, especially on the housing and mental health side, so we can also talk through your recommendations. So on the port, I guess I'll just note, we know I made an ask to the Enterprise and Utility Oversight Committee to help us with that. Certainly want to work with the port. I mentioned it to the CFO in terms of what our ask will be. And then we want to make sure to emphasize our appreciation to the legislature for the funding they've already provided. So beyond that, I don't know if there's other questions or comments on that one, but that's the plan right now.
So are you asking for questions on the port specifically?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I have a question.
Oh, go ahead, Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe you addressed this and I just wasn't listening. So SB 155, I guess I'm just wondering on the timeliness of us needing to address that. Are we expecting SB 155 to get any traction this next legislative session? Or is this like a 2 years or 3 years down the line question?
I can speak to that a little. And maybe Mr. Johnson has more. The Enterprise and Utilities Committee requested that I reach out to Senator Hoffman's office, because he's the one who originated it, and they are kind of out on break right now. His chief of staff, Tim Grusendorf, was going to get back to us in October, November. I doubt that they are ready to present, but I think the Enterprise and Utilities chairs wanted to put some pressure on them to say, like, if you introduce something like this that affects Anchorage, you better plan on presenting to us. So I think that's about where we're at, unless anyone has more information.
No, I guess I'll just add too, I know, it was introduced right at the end of session. And so I think, and that's kind of what we were discussing, is how specific to get in there. I know individual members do have feelings and opinions about it, but I think we're just trying to figure out kind of what is the way to vet that proposal and understand it better, and then whether or not it goes in here. Ms. Bronco?
So I can't remember the name of the lady that was the lobbyist. Wendy Chu. Okay, so I kind of thought I took away that she was thinking there was some port fatigue, and that, maybe you know, my personal feeling is I'm a little fatigued already. I just got on the assembly. So, you know, maybe a kind of a break in the ask wouldn't be bad, but.
Yeah, I think noted, so, and on that note too, I think there's not new information that we would add here, so it's just something we'll continue to work through. And so before we move on to the housing and homelessness, I wanted to go back, Member Martinez had, a question or a comment on the department priorities, because I don't believe that we're gonna spend a lot of time there, so I just wanna, address that, so go ahead, Mr. Martinez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just 2 points of clarification. First, I think Egan is spelled wrong under upgrade to recreational and civic facilities, so that the extra A is in there. But one item that I want to make sure is written down, it seems like it's in the area but not clearly defined, is the Mulcahy Stadium and the Chester Creek Sports Complex. I think, you know, there's the element there of one of the arenas, but being real clear about the Mulcahy Stadium, I think that was, if that hadn't been addressed already, that needs to be on that, and then just the clarification on Egan.
Yeah, thank you, that is a good addition, so I think we can add that, under department priorities, and then I imagine that could also fit under, the East Anchorage District priorities too, so regardless of where it goes, we'll make sure it's in there.
Well, just for point of information, why would that go under East Anchorage?
Sorry, maybe I'm
Yeah.
confused about the location.
Yeah, the Chester Creek Sports Complex is the whole area where Mulcahy Stadium and all the fields are, where, so that whole area, but Mulcahy is a real opportunity to make sure it's on that list there with those other recreational facilities.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the clarification. And I think that's something too to note for the budget process too, to the extent that there may be bond or other places, so we can also just flag that for members as well.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Ross.
Is that, Mr. Martinez, what is that listed on the CIB, on the administration's list from project engineering?
I hadn't crossed that.
Okay, on the quick
I
list
feel like
that
I saw Mulcahy one place, but not seeing it here makes me raise the flag again.
I just bring it up, I can double check to make sure that I have it. Anyhow, I'm not seeing, I'm seeing it under parks, and it looks like parks wasn't going for any state requests this year. My point was just that if there's projects like that that are important to you, just to double check to make sure they're in the appropriate place in the CIB when you do that process with the budget. And then also, we wanted to list all of the department priorities so we could go in as a unified group, and if Parks Department or Project Management and Engineering were gonna go to Juneau and advocate for their projects, it would look like we endorse it. But those projects are there's just so many that I don't think we'll be talking about any of them unless any of you wanna move them forward either into your district or municipal-wide priorities. Otherwise, we'll leave those to the departments to advocate for on their own.
Sorry, so I'm Ms. Costello and then Ms. Rocca.
Thank you. Something I think we might want to consider is moving some of the more, they might reside in somebody's district, but they might have statewide economic development application or statewide, participation. And so I might want to suggest that we think about maybe putting up in one of the main priorities or the additional municipal-wide priorities, just a section on infrastructure, and then you can loop in, Ben Boeke, Dempsey, the PAC, Egan Center, rather than listing them under the specific legislative district and then leaving it up to that individual, person to lobby for. So that's just something I think we should think about. Moving that infrastructure up and deciding, what goes there and what we list there.
Yeah, thank you, that's a good point. And I think, again, it's why it's helpful to get everything on the table so that we can think about how to craft our narrative and what the asks need to be, and then kind of, and do we have a lot that we have to balance? So thank you. Ms. Bronca?
So in that same, the upgrades to recreation civic facilities, so my understanding is that Denina and Egan has a pool of money from bed tax that takes care of its maintenance and any sort of upgrades that it needs. That pool of money is getting kind of big, like, when did you look at 26 million or something? So I'm kind of wondering why they would even be listed on here.
So we might be getting into the weeds with that. If you recall, you got this document with 120-day memo. I just pulled the stuff that the administration has for their state requests, so I think make a note of that, and when you start to do the budget review process, to ask them why it's in here. And otherwise, you as members and we as staff and the lobbyists probably won't touch any of these departmental priorities unless they happen to also be one of your priorities. Otherwise, we'll just, once the CIP is finalized, we'll just put them in here.
Yeah, so I'm gonna suggest, and also because we're still waiting on the budget, and so there may be changes, so I think definitely at our October legislative committee meeting, I think we'll have more information so we can dig back into those. But in the meantime, if you do see things that are missing or you have questions, please send them directly to Clarion Legislative Services staff, because they're compiling the list, and we can continue to work through those. So then I'm gonna bring us back up to the kind of top priorities, and then we have increasing supply of housing and addressing homelessness, and the rationale for putting those together is they were very related topics, but also acknowledging that there's different pieces to them. So right now they're listed together, and then I'll just note that we have some brief notes about kind of, you know, telling the story of what the unity's been doing in the last year, and then knowing that there were some asks last year. But I think I'll actually turn it over to Mr. Rivera to speak through some of the requests that you put on the table as draft. And so that is the separate one-page printout that we have in front of us.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. So I'll just speak to two of these as they're relevant to this specific top priority area we're discussing. So I have put together just a few different priorities in housing, behavioral health, and in homelessness. And these primarily come from the Alaska Municipal League Housing Working Group, which was formed, I think it was formed last year, some of the work that they have done. And then the Complex Behavioral Health Needs Community Task Force final report, which we accepted at the September 12th Assembly meeting. And then constituent communications. So I'll walk through the housing ones first. So first one request is essentially the governor and legislature encouraging the relevant state agencies. I don't name it in here, but it'll likely be AHFC, possibly another agency, but I don't know. And encouraging them to more actively use their bonding and loaning authorities that they have. In the rationale, I won't walk through all of this, but in the rationale you can see, or in the background I should say, you can see some examples of in the past how the state has played a big role in loaning and bonding for local jurisdictions, and they're not playing as big of a role nowadays in that. So encouraging them to play a bigger role. Second one here is the creation of a special legislative committee on housing. So believe it or not, there is no policy forum for the legislature to really talk about housing policy. There was a work group or a task force rather that was convened in 2016, but beyond that, housing I think is just something that is discussed just in various forums. There's not really a concrete way for them to do that, and so that is one of the requests outlined in here. Third one is revolving a state infrastructure revolving fund. So there's currently, Department of Environmental Conservation has a revolving loan fund, and we actually use it a lot in the municipality. I think it's ABU that uses it frequently. And so there is a model to do some type of revolving loan fund in the state. So I don't see any reason why we should ask the state to consider using that model and replicating it for some type of state infrastructure revolving fund. And then last is encouraging all the parties to robustly fund the Alaska Housing Trust, which I believe is already mentioned in here. I don't need to explain why that's important. Then on homelessness, there's two requests here. First one is specifically requesting the governor to give ownership of Alaska's plan to end homelessness. So we all know Anchored Home Plan. That is the Anchorage continuum of care. That is our plan to end homelessness. The states, the Balance of State is what it's called, Balance of State Continuum of Care. They have the Alaska's plan to end long-term homelessness is what it's called. And their plan actually ended in 2019. So it was a 10-year plan that was adopted in 2009, ended in 2019. And then the last time there was a status report on that plan was in 2018. The ownership of that plan is in the Alaska Council on the Homeless, which is a council that is appointed by the governor. If you look comparatively, the Anchorage COC is the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness, a non-governmental organization, right? They're not associated with government, they're their own separate nonprofit. So they are the ones that are responsible for the Anchored Home Plan. Comparatively, the Alaska Coalition on Housing and Homelessness, they are the sister organization for the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness. And so if we're trying to do apples to apples, then it would make sense for the Alaska Coalition on Housing and Homelessness to own that plan. And I think we've talked a little bit in various housing and homelessness committees and other forums about how having a plan and having the organizations working together on a plan is really an effective and efficient way for us to try to make progress. And right now, it seems to me like that isn't something that is necessarily happening on the state level. So seeing if we can get the governor to address that. And then the second request here is basically funding for congregate and non-congregate shelter. So the state has a variety of funds that they administer when it comes to congregate and non-congregate shelter, and basically asking them to more robustly fund that, or at least not to reduce that funding, which members may remember that in 2019, the governor did veto some of this funding, which caused a panic in Anchorage. So those are the main ones for housing and homelessness. I'll talk about the behavioral health ones later.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Greer, and thank you for also bringing forward the work from AML, because I know it helps if we're advocating for the same things that others are around the state. Does anybody have comments or questions on these?
I have a question.
Yep, go ahead, Ms. Ross.
The Housing Trust was funded last year, I believe, and then the Anchorage didn't get any. I don't know if it's because we didn't apply or we weren't accepted. And then they're all pretty small. So do you have, I think maybe it would help if we had a specific financial amount that we asked for. And then how do you think Anchorage plays into that?
Yeah, thanks. So yes, the Alaska Housing Trust got a fairly small dollar amount. Actually, I think their dollar amount was vetoed partially by the governor. So they did get a very small dollar amount, and with that, I think they tried to do what they could. I think the goal of the Alaska Housing Trust is to try to develop a corpus, a large corpus that spins off and they can help fund projects year after year. And of course, it's a statewide trust, so they're going to try to have statewide impact. So same thing with the AHFC. They are also a statewide organization, and sometimes Anchorage doesn't get any projects with AHFC funding. Some years we do, some years we don't. It just depends. The Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness, though, is one of the folks who have been, along with the Alaska Coalition on Housing and Homelessness, have been spearheading this effort. So I'm happy to reach out to them and see if we can maybe get a specific dollar number that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions or comments?
I guess that would also go for the robust funding in the budget for operational costs of congregate and non-congregate shelter. I think it just felt like last year, the more specific we could be, the better with our ask.
Yeah, and on that point too, I'll also acknowledge we have Alexis Johnson from the Anchorage Health Department. And so I know we're, the administration's in the process of developing a budget, but since we're on this topic, Alexis, I don't know if you have other comments as far as state requests for shelter funding, because I think just to say, we know HUD and many other funding sources don't specifically provide operating funding for that, and so we're looking at places that can, and so the state is obviously one of those. And so, Ms. Johnson, I don't know if you have comments on that, or if you do have a specific dollar amount, we'd love to have that, but I know it's early.
Through the chair to Ms. Brawley, we did present earlier what the health department determined would be a fully funded budget for a year-round shelter up to 150 people with navigation services on site. That estimate was about 7.9 annually. And so if we wanted to revisit that to see if there were inflationary costs or costs for year over year, we could definitely investigate that as well. But we're estimating around $8 million for an annual year-round low barrier shelter with navigation services for up to 150 people.
Thank you. And I know that that we're obviously in the process of looking at what that looks like long-term as well. And so we'll get as specific as we can this year, but I think even just saying that is a need and giving some order of scale is helpful. Okay, any other comments on this topic? Not seeing any. Okay, then why don't we go ahead and move on to, so we have it listed as crisis now and mental health, but we also can describe it as behavioral health. And so just to note, those are the same broad topic. And so there I'll also turn to, I guess I'll briefly comment and then turn to Mr. Rivera. So what we've listed here is really wanting to emphasize the importance of the Crisis Now model, which is something that's being implemented statewide, including in Anchorage. Obviously, other partners are involved in that. The Assembly granted Providence $1 million for the crisis stabilization facility that is coming online. So that's part of the story we can tell. And so I think what we're interested then in again, is just emphasizing the limits of what our community can do and then what is needed at the state level. And so with that, I will turn to Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. So the middle of these three issues, behavioral health, so three requests on this one. So first one has to deal with Medicaid 1115 waiver, and specifically the billing for those. A lot of behavioral health providers aren't able to get billed, or they're not able to bill Medicaid for some of the services that they want to provide, specifically for people experiencing homelessness. Things like mobile outreach, they're not able to, under the current system, bill Medicaid for those. And so this is actually timely because the Alaska Department of Health is going through their renewal process for the Medicaid 1115 waiver, and they're looking at possibly making some adjustments, some policy decisions on how that 1115 waiver will be administered. And at the Behavioral Health Summit, the Commissioner Hedberg, is that right? Okay, thanks. The Commissioner did talk about some changes that they are considering, and it does fall in line with what is detailed here. So I think the municipality of Anchorage telling the Alaska Department of Health that yes, we endorse the work you're doing, please do it, it's important, would be helpful. Second request here is, again, for the Alaska Department of Health, specifically around enrollment and access to services and Medicaid, Social Security, SSI. That's also something that we heard through the Complex Behavioral Health Needs Community Task Force process and the summit about, especially when it comes to issues with enrollment in Medicaid and then access to services. You'll read in the background that there's specific issues, specific things that you need to do in order to get access to Medicaid services that for individuals experiencing homelessness, especially if they have co-occurring mental health and substance misuse issues, this is very difficult. So the more that we make it easier for folks to access services and not put up barriers, the better. And the Alaska Department of Health is the agency best primed to deal with that. And then the last one here is a state law request, specifically state labor laws, which do not allow behavioral health staff to work 12-hour shifts. So currently nurses are allowed to work 12-hour shifts, but behavioral health staff are not. And that is, especially considering the workforce shortages that behavioral health providers are facing, and everyone is really facing, that inability for behavioral health staff to work 12-hour shifts is impeding their ability to provide the services that they want to provide. And so this request actually comes directly from behavioral health workers who want to have that flexibility. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll see if there's any comments or questions on these recommendations. Go ahead, Ms. Ross.
Yeah, my question is for Ms. Costello. On these ones that are more departmental level, what do you think is the best way to activate our supporters in the legislature to put pressure on the departments, or do we have assembly members or community members go right to the departments? Do you have a suggestion on a strategy for that?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank Assemblyman Rivera for putting this together. I think it's very valuable. And I think the first step would be to put some of the legislative or the state, law changes that you were hoping to get in the legislative booklet, just list them, briefly, and then perhaps the background could be on the information pages that you might carry yourself to the legislature. I would say work through the committee process and the committee chairs and contacting them. They have the public meetings and those issues can come up. And I think working the committee and working the committee chairs would be a really good way to do it. There's also lunches that are sponsored and informational lunches, and you can, request a legislator host one of those so that certain issues can get some visibility. And those things are also on public. They're on the website and they're, videotaped. The committee, though, has the official testimony and official documentation, so I always encourage people to work through the committee process. Some of these items, I'm wondering if there's legislation that's already in the hopper that we could look to amend, perhaps, so I could start looking through the list of bills that are out there. I know some of these issues have come up before, and the waiver issues definitely come up, and writing a letter or passing a resolution is also very helpful. So those ways of communicating are always helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Costello, and yeah, I think that perspective is appreciated for sure. And then I think also it's just a reminder to folks, the legislative program is one tool, and then we've passed resolutions in support or theory in opposition to things, and we can also make statements that way. So I think it's not an either or for sure. And so we continue to work these and make sure that it gets to the right folks who need to hear these recommendations. Okay, other comments on this one? Go ahead, Ms. Margaret.
So I was thinking about untenable with the treatment and how the individuals experiencing homelessness accessing Medicaid funds to get that paid for. But also we're really in a real crisis for providers that their money is being held back and they're not getting paid quickly enough that they want to take those clients. And just the Medicare part, my mom got moved from that senior care thing at Providence to Anchorage Neighborhood Health Center, and she was very lucky that they took her, but it's like 3 weeks to get an appointment. And so, and we keep getting told, well, we are losing money on these patients, so I don't know how we're gonna address that, but that's kind of off this topic, but sort of on it. It's both sides are losing.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Fraga. I think that's also, some of these items will have really specific asks or a project that we would like funded, and then other things I think maybe maybe the main thing will be identifying the problem and saying, you know, that this is not something the meeting can solve. And so I think that's what we want to keep working through as well. And then, of course, that's where it's important to be engaging with folks at other levels of government and helping others who are already advocating on that point too. Because I know there's a lot of folks really focused on trying to make behavioral health services work better and health services. With that, because I also recognize we've only got a few minutes left, and again, this is really a working draft. I wonder if we have any more information about the energy security, maybe we could touch on that one. And then otherwise, I was going to make time at the end for this kind of other potential meeting-wide priorities, because those are more of a question mark. So on the energy piece, I don't know if there's anybody who wants to speak to that one.
Is that in this?
It's in the top.
Yeah, it's the fourth one on the second page.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's on the middle of page 2, and I guess as it notes, you know, we know there's an expected gas shortage of Pine Cook Inlet, so that's the big picture. But I don't know that we have a specific ask at this point, so it's on the list. Okay, I don't see anybody who has burning desire to talk about that one, so we'll figure out if that one, and again, maybe that one doesn't stay at the top level ask because it's intended or noted, but would still be obviously a meeting-wide priority. So then I want to point us to, go ahead, Mr. Bear.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. You know, I'm wondering if it might make sense for someone, maybe one of the co-chairs of Interreg Utilities, to talk to Chugach Electric about this issue, because maybe they have some ideas of what would make sense to lobby the legislature, governor, and administration for.
Yeah, thank you, that's a great suggestion. And then we'll note too, I know this body has recently passed resolutions in support of renewable energy and kind of related topics, and so perhaps that's also another direction to go, but I agree that speaking with Chugach Electric would be helpful. So then I want to point us to, on the following page, this header, other potential meeting-wide priorities. So as it's noted, these are from last year. So since we only have a few minutes left, I just wanted to see if folks have, and I see wildfire protection is listed twice, but if there's other, just if there's other things, or just things to put on the list that we can investigate further that aren't here already. So just open note if anybody wants to comment on these. Go ahead, Ms. Martha. And Mr. Bear.
So we probably should note, we're gonna have that joint meeting with ASD. Says item plan for 12A joint meeting, but there's gonna be a group of us get together to talk about writing a resolution for the base student allocation. And I think they're looking at second week of October for the first gathering.
Yeah, thank you, and I'll just note that's the bottom of page 2, related to public school funding. And so in addition to the PSA increase, the amount that the base student allocation is, there's a group who's gonna be working on recommending changes to the actual formula as well, so that'll come forward. It may not get into this in time, but we're gonna generally speak to it, because I think there's broad agreement that the formula itself is not working, so. Other comments, Mr. Rivera?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So I do like these additional municipal-wide priorities. I'm actually thinking about sort of the organization and structure of this whole thing. And you know, this is intended for legislators primarily, for us to take to them and for them to be able to use these to easily get a sense of the municipality's priorities. And I'm wondering, and we actually have a former legislator here, so maybe you can help out with this. But you know, I'm wondering, legislators, when it comes to the organization of these, are they going to be looking at things that are mainly tied to committees that they serve on, as these are issues that I'm really interested in diving into, or a legislator is going to have a more broad global perspective?
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the question. It's definitely a broader view. Sometimes your committee assignments aren't necessarily your first choice. And then, of course, all of the issues that have a fiscal component will go to the Senate or House Finance Committee. So you work with your colleagues, but I would say, having walked the district, attended community council meetings, talked to assembly members, talked to constituents, that they have a particular insight into their district and what the needs are. And some projects that actually get funded don't really show up on lists. I mean, there's something that really perhaps are generated from the community interest. And so that's why Assemblywoman Braga, when you talk about a particular road that you're hoping to have on the list, I think looking at this list early and getting those projects on here will help a little bit so that, when you go down, you can actually point to those. But, you're really calling from your community knowledge of what the community desires and what projects have, been in the queue for a while that maybe didn't get funded. Or sometimes there are safety projects that come up, like the lighting on Jewel Lake was a safety issue that came up that we were able to get in at the, in the process. So it's a very broad view that oftentimes goes outside the committees that people serve on.
Great, thanks for those insights, that's very helpful. Yeah, I'm just wondering, especially if this program gets very large, which it seems like it might be getting really large, I'm not exactly sure. How we can just make sure that this is organized in a way that legislators can consume it easily. And I guess I'll just leave that to other folks to chew on. And I guess while I have the mic, I will say this idea of department priorities, I'm just wondering if, perception-wise, if maybe there's another way that we can categorize that, because this whole program really should be, these are our priorities as the municipality of Anchorage. So I just don't want to have anyone perceive that these specific priorities are not something that the Assembly supports if we just call them department priorities, right? I'll just toss it out. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Rivera. And I also want to acknowledge is past 220, I wonder if we could get consent to go to 225, and then we'll definitely be done. Any objection? Okay. And thank you. That is a great point. And then to segue into that, I think that is really the work of the next month or so, and then working parallel to the actual review and development of the budget, because we want to look at it, as we said, what should we bond for, what should we be asking the state for, and then I agree. I think rethinking kind of the phrase department priorities, and maybe I like the idea of categorizing maybe by infrastructure, or maybe Parks and Rec, or not just Parks and Rec, the department, but other kind of big categories that we can talk about what investments we're hoping the state would make, or other policy changes. And so that's something maybe to send back with Ms. Costello as the administration works through your priorities, kind of if there's other ways to describe them, and then help us from the department side prioritize those as well. And so I think then really just the thing to leave folks with is this is obviously a work in progress. If there are things not on this document already that you would like to put on the document, please send those, or just things that you would like to add for consideration. And then I think the work over the next month or so, including at our next committee meeting, will be to hopefully start narrowing this down and really making sure everybody's priorities are represented, but that we can, as Mr. Rivera said, be targeted and strategic. And so again, if you have other things, comments on these or other ideas, or you hear things from your community, please send them directly to Legislative Services staff, because they're going to be keeping this document. So by that I mean Claire and Jennifer. And then we will come back to this next month and continue to work on it. So with that, I think we are adjourned. All right. Thank you, everyone.